So today we're going to be talking about population ecology. Previously we have defined what a population is. So let's look at that real quick. What is a population? Population is a group of the same species that lives in one area. If you remember that we've talked about this before, um, a population, multiple populations come together to make a community, and the community with the physical environment creates an ecosystem. But a population is looking at just a single species that live together in one area, in one habitat. So all of these penguins together are one population. All of these fish together are one population. There are other populations of the same species that live elsewhere, but within this one area, in this same area, we have this single population. So hopefully we remember most of that. So again, we're talking about population ecology, and so we're going to look at 5 characteristics of a population. We have the geographic distribution, we have density, dispersion, growth rate, and the age structure. So as we continue on through this lesson and through your guided notes, these are going to be the 5 topics. Essentially, we're going to be looking at these 5 characteristics of population. So first, geographic distribution. It's the geographic distribution, the how population is spread out across their habitat. So it's going to be the range of the population, or a description of the area that is inhabited by the population. So we can be as small scale as mold on a piece of bread. The space, the the space that the mold takes up on the bread being our geographic structure here. So how much space on this piece of bread the mold takes over, and what it hasn't taken over, what it still has available to it to take over. So it can increase its geographic distribution if it hasn't taken over all of the bread. Or it could be as large scale as migration, the migration area of whales. So there are some species of whales that do migrate. So the geographic distribution of whales is going to be a massive span, being from one area of an ocean all the way up to a different area, or down to a different area of the ocean that the whales are migrating to. So the geographic distribution of these whales is going to be a huge area in which, depending on what time of the year, uh, we're looking at where we can find these whales. Nothing too mind-blowing or crazy here with geographic distribution. Next, we have population density. So this is our second characteristic of a population we're looking at, and it's looking at how many individuals are in a single unit of space. So area, if you think back or over to geometry, if you have taken it yet, we know that area is calculated in a unit squared. So most of the time with a population, we're going to look at kilometers squared, or meters squared, miles squared, or you might hear that being said square miles or square kilometers. And we can actually calculate this density, and to do that we would have to go out into the wild, look at whatever species it is that we're looking for, and count the number of individuals we find within an area that we searched. And this area, again, has to be in units squared. We'll look a little more specifically what how that looks like in a minute. So this population density is going to vary depending on who you are or what you are. So different species are going to prefer different densities within their populations. Some might want to be really close to other individuals of their own species. Others might want to be very far apart from one another. And then the ecosystem is also going to influence this, whether there's a lot of space within this ecosystem that allows organisms to spread out a whole bunch, or whether there's very little space that forces them to be closer together. That's going to influence the density of our populations. So looking at an example of how to calculate density, again, look at this formula. We have numbers of individuals divided by the area in units squared is going to give us our population density. So let's go here. If we have a scientist sampling a population of deer and he counted 200 individuals within an area of 10 square kilometers, what's the density of this deer population per square kilometer? Remember that we have our formula saying the number over the area, the number of ooh, the number of individuals we found divided by the area. So here we have our number of individuals found is 200 divided by the area that we searched, which was 10 kilometers squared. So that gives us 200 divided by 10. So going to be 20 deer, 20 deer per square kilometer. So this is our density, the density of this population within this 10 square mile space. There's going to be about 20 in every square kilometer. I might have said mile there, I meant kilometer. This is actually a picture of the density of the United States back in 2000. So if we look at this legend here, we see that the lighter colors, white, transition over to darker colors where white is the least densely populated, where the violet color is the most densely populated. We can tell that out west we have a much lower density than we do over here in the east. We have a lot of yellow, a few whites, a little bit of green in there, and these are much lower density areas where we only have in the whites 1 to 2 people per square mile or 1 to 4 people per square mile on average in this space over here to the west. Over here in the east, we're much more densely populated, where we're looking at places in the teal that are 25 to 49 people per square mile. Dark teal, 50 to 99. Blue is 100 to 249 people per square mile. And then this violet, huge range, of 250 people to almost 67,000 people per square mile. If you look at Polk County, little old Polk County, right here, we are actually in this violet range. We've got probably on the lower end of this violet range, a couple hundred people per square mile within Polk County. We are highly, we have a high density in our own population. Our next characteristic we're going to look at is dispersion. So dispersion is how we are spread out within the density of our population, so the spatial distribution of individuals within the population. And we have 3 types of dispersion. We have clumped dispersion, or you might hear me say clustered dispersion. We have even dispersion, and we have random dispersion. So clumped dispersion, individuals are clustered together. So if we look at this little picture here, we can see we have these individual little clusters of organisms that have separated from the rest of the population to create smaller little clusters. And there are a number of things that might contribute to this dispersion pattern. One being resources, where food is, where water is, where living spaces are. If you require certain characteristics about where you're going to live, you're going to go towards where those characteristics are. You're going to go towards that food. You're going to go towards that water. It also might be part of a social behavior. So we have animals that herd, we have birds that flock, we have fish that school, and we have big groups of bees that live in hives. They are all clustering, living in social groups together. So they have this clumped or clustered dispersion pattern. Our next one, we have even dispersion, or it's also called uniform dispersion, where individuals are separated by pretty much an even distance. This is normally a result of kind of an antisocial interaction. Each individual wants to be as far apart from one another as they possibly can. So this is going to ultimately result in this kind of even dispersion where they're getting as far away from each other as they possibly can. An exception to this would be when they come together for mating activities, but then after that is over, they're going to separate again. This also might be a result of limited resources and competition. Um, so while if we look at um, if we look at this individual, he has found this area in which he has resources that he wants and needs, and he's going to defend and compete for these resources and make sure they stay his. And so that's going to push this one away. So then he's going to find this area that's going to be his that he's going to protect. And so then it's going to push this one away. He's going to find this area, protect it. So this is going to be a result of the competition where we get an even dispersion. We also might have this coming from a result of nesting. So birds like these Patagonian seabirds, there are tons and tons of them, thousands in fact, and only so much space that they're able to nest in. And so they want to be as far apart from one another as they possibly can to defend their nests, but there's so many of them that they end up looking like they're really close together. But each one of these nests, there's a bird sitting on each one of these nests, and they are separated by they're just out of pecking range from one another. And so they are as far apart from one another as they possibly can, given how many of them there are. Finally, we have random dispersion, and this means that each individual is in a location that's independent of the location of other individuals. So like with even dispersion and clump dispersion, each of these individuals are dependent on other organisms to know where they're going to be. One individual is going to make sure it stays with its clump, so its location is dependent upon the others. And even each one of these individuals wants to be as far apart away from the others as it can be, so its location is dependent upon where these other guys are to make sure they stay far apart. With random, it's independent. They don't care where the other organisms are. And a great example of this is seed dispersal. So when a plant depends on wind to disperse its seeds, then it can't control where the wind blows its seeds, so it's going to be completely random where they wind up. Or if a plant depends on animals to disperse its seeds, it can't control where those animals are going to drop their seeds. So it ends up being completely random. Next, we have growth rate. So it's the amount by which a population size changes in a given time, and it's a measure of the speed of reproduction. We have factors that affect the population size, and that's going to be the number of births, the number of deaths, and migration. And there's two types of migration. We have immigration and we have emigration. So what's the difference? In immigration, we have individuals coming into an area. That's immigration. So we have people coming to the United States or immigrating to the United States. And we also have emigration, where we have individuals leaving an area. So these have to happen simultaneously. Every time we have somebody coming to a new area, they have to be leaving a different area. So immigration and emigration always happen as a pair. But emigration would be somebody, for example, leaving the United States. They're going to a different area. Populations are dynamic, meaning that in time they change in size and composition. So, again, going back to the United States, over time, our population changes in size. Most of the time, it's growing, and it also changes in composition. Who makes up our population is going to change. Some other factors that are going to influence the dynamics of a population are the birth rate, the death rate or mortality rate, and the life expectancy. Life expectancy and death rate are not the same, they're different. Life expectancy is pretty constant, it doesn't change very often. If we look at the life expectancy of an eagle, it's going to stay pretty much the same over generation to generation. However, the death rate might be a little bit different depending on some other factors. Is there some sort of natural disaster that wipes out more hawks than usual? Is there some sort of disease that goes through the population that wipes out more than usual? This is going to affect the death rate, but not the life expectancy. So these are some pretty logical statements. But if we have more individuals being born than we have that are dying in a given period of time, we know that the population size should increase when we have more being born than dying. If the birth rate is equal to the death rate, then the population size should stay the same. If the death rate is greater than the birth rate, then we have more dying than we have being born, then our population will decrease in size. So we have some other factors affecting the population, the biggest one being the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is the maximum number of organisms a given area can support. So if we look at this graph here, we have this line, this is K. This is our carrying capacity. This will be the number of organisms a given environment is able to support. And this graphed line is our population size. And generally, as we approach the carrying capacity, our population growth rate will start to slow down. But we can't continue to live above our carrying capacity. We can live below our carrying capacity, and that does happen sometimes, and we'll see in a minute how. So it's the actual size that we're able to support. Most of the time, a population will be a little bit above the carrying capacity or a little bit below the carrying capacity, and it's going to fluctuate. When we're below the carrying capacity, our birth rate will increase, so we'll have more individuals living and surviving off of the available resources, and so in turn, that's going to result in more organisms there to reproduce, so our birth rate will increase. When we go above our carrying capacity, we have exceeded what the environment is able to support. So there's going to be individuals that are going to die and starve off, which is going to, again, decrease our population size. Where's this graph here? I'll go and skip forward. Actually, no, I won't. We'll come back to that in a minute. So some other things that will affect our population is our limiting factor. The resource that runs out first is the one that's our limiting factor. So within any environment, we talk about resources. There are multiple resources we need. We need food, we need water, we need some sort of shelter generally, or some at least place to live, whether that be in a tree, whether that be in a hole in the ground. We need these resources. So the one that runs out first is the one that we call our limiting factor. So this limiting factor is the one that sets our carrying capacity. Again, the carrying capacity being the maximum number of organisms that available resources can support. Well, we're only as strong as our weakest link. We can only support as many organisms as our limiting factor allows. So we can only support as many organisms as our smallest resource is able to support. Some other limiting factors or some other factors that limit a population could be things like competition. So if there's competition between organisms, then um, they're going to be competing for the same resources. So we're not going to be able to just exponentially grow a population because we're going to be fighting for certain resources and defending resources from others. Predation, parasitism, and disease, drought and other climate extremes like floods or just natural disasters, and then human disturbances are going to be some other factors that could influence population size. So these types of limiting factors fall into two groups. There are density-dependent factors and density-independent factors. So dependent factors, density-dependent factors, are determined by the size of the population, and only when the population density reaches a certain level do they come into play. So things like competition, predation, parasitism, and disease aren't really an issue until we get to a certain density within a population. Density-independent factors are things like unusual weather or natural disasters, so floods and fires, or human activities like cutting down forests. It doesn't matter whether there's a high density or a low density of organisms for things like these to happen. They're going to happen regardless, whether there's a bunch of them or a few of them. Weather doesn't care. It's going to do its thing regardless. So how do we work around these sorts of things? We have different strategies, two very general groups of strategies or strategists. The first one being our strategists. So these are organisms where the population is usually not near the carrying capacity. That's because we have they're highly affected by abiotic factors, things like weather. So before they ever start to get near the carrying capacity, before they start to use all of the resources, normally something like a special weather event or something else that is an abiotic factor, something not living, something like that is going to reduce the population before they get close to this carrying capacity. So when we graph their population growth, we get a J curve, and we'll look at that in just a moment, but it means that they have a very fast growth rate. And normally these sorts of animals have a small body size and a short lifespan, and they have many offspring in a short time. They make cheap offspring, and this means that they're cheap energetically. The parents don't expend a lot of energy in producing or in raising their offspring. What they do is they make a bunch of them and just play the game of odds. They hope that by dropping off a whole bunch of offspring that a couple of them will survive into adulthood. And a good example of this being sea turtles. So sea turtles lay their eggs and the mamas go back into the water and they're done. So then it's up to the baby sea turtles to hatch and to make it into the water. And in reality, majority of these sea turtles die, whether they get picked up by birds trying to get to the ocean, whether they drown while trying to get into the ocean, or even if they do get into the ocean, they're still very small and susceptible to being eaten, so they might get eaten. And so even within the dozens of baby sea turtles that get hatched out of one nest, one or two might survive into adulthood. So these are very cheap. The mom doesn't do anything to protect them or raise them. She just lays a bunch of eggs and hopes that a few of them will live. Some other R strategists are things like mice and rats, rabbits, oysters, lots and lots of examples. This is our J curve. Like I told you a minute ago, these R strategists have this J curve where we get sort of a slight J shape So this is our green line up here is our carrying capacity. So before we ever get close to our carrying capacity, there's going to be some sort of density independent factor that affects the population and drops our population. So there's going to be some sort of fire, there's going to be a drought, something that's going to affect the population significantly to drop their population, and then they'll reclimb, and they reclimb very fast. It has this exponential growth. On the flip side of R strategists, we have K strategists, and these are the ones that usually live right around the carrying capacity of their environment. They generate what we call an S-curve growth, and we'll look at that in a moment. And while R strategists are highly affected by abiotic factors, K strategists are highly affected by biotic factors, things like competition, things like available resources, things like that. Usually they have large body size, and they only have a few offspring, and they live a really long time. So things like people are strategists. Lions are R strategists, dogs are R strategists. They don't just have a whole bunch of offspring at once and then kind of dump them off and hope they live. They're going to invest more energy into these offspring, making sure that they survive. So they have a few and ensure that their offspring survive, where R strategists have a bunch and play the odds, hoping a few will survive. This is this S graph or S curve. See, if we look here, we get little S's, and we have our carrying capacity. Our K strategists are going to fluctuate above and below this carrying capacity. So they're going to end up going above the carrying capacity. They're going to exceed what this environment can support. So some are going to starve and die off. The population will drop back down. Now we have available resources again. So we're going to end up with an increase in the birth rates as more organisms start living and are able to reproduce. Eventually we're going to cross back over a carrying capacity, and this process will just recur over and over and over. But again, we are controlled by density dependent factors. How many there are of us depends on our survival. And finally, we have age structure. So the growth of a population depends on how many organisms make up the given population, and the future growth of a population is predicted using age structure diagrams. So what does that really mean? If we look at a graph like this, we have, as we go up this graph, an increase in age. Down the center of this graph, where we go from blue to pink, I guess that color is purple, pink, we have 0. So we're really looking at percentages as we go out in either direction, in the middle being at 0%. So as we go out, we're looking at what percentage of this age range is a boy and what percentage of this age range is a girl. And we're really interested in ranges of ages. That's why they're shown here. So in an age structured diagram, we will use red here. In an age structured diagram, we're really, for the purposes of population growth, concerned with the age that is reproductively able and the age group that is upcoming in reproductionally able. So in general, we'll call the 45 to 49 the top of our reproductively able age range, and we'll play it cool here and say it's going to be ooh, no, I didn't want that one. I'm wanting to go to 24. What is this range? Somewhere about here. 20 to 24 range. So this is the range in which we have reproductively able members of our population. So if we look at this and see that this number is a huge bulk of our population. These are the guys that are actively reproducing, making more members of our population. So below this range, we have the up and coming reproductively able members of our population. If we have a larger number of up and coming reproductively able members than we have of currently reproductive members, that means we're going to have a very rapid growth in our reproduction, in our population size in the time to come. Because when these guys, if there's more of them, if these guys are outnumbering the reproductively able group as it is now, all of these guys are going to end up shifting into this next range and all reproduce themselves. So it's going to produce an even larger group after them down here once all of these guys have reproduced. So we're going to have an increase in our population as time goes on with that. So these are three just kind of different ways to look at, well, not ways to look, these are three different scenarios in which these graphs might exist in. So this one over here to the left is very similar to the one we just looked at, this pyramid shape. This pyramid shape is always going to indicate that there's going to be a rapid growth in the population in the up and coming near future. When we look at a graph like the one with the United States, again, we'll look at the group that is kind of reproductively able. So we see this group, and this group is roughly the same size as the up and coming reproductively able group. So that's telling me that we're going to have a relatively slow growth. There's not really going to be much change in the growth rate when these guys become reproductively able and these guys shift out. It's going to be pretty much the same. There's going to be a slow growth. Now when we shift over to Italy, we see that our reproductively able group is actually kind of significantly larger than the up and coming group. So that tells me that if anything, we're going to have a population decrease, or at least it's going to be a no growth scenario for Italy. So when we have this kind of squared off shape over here in the United States, we know we're going to have slow growth. When we have this shape where we're kind of skinny on the bottom and fat in the middle, that means we're going to have no growth. And again, with this pyramid shape, we're going to have rapid growth. So these are the three shapes of these age structure diagrams you should be familiar with. I'm going to go ahead and cut this off here. We could talk a little bit more about how human population has grown, but I think we'll do that in class instead. Come see me if you have any questions. Make sure you have filled out the entirety of your guided notes. I will be checking them.